Good afternoon. This week we're going to continue with peace studies as another alternative to power politics, which we started to talk 2 weeks ago, and still we continue with that. And this peace studies is going to be our last concept under alternative points to power politics. So let's start with it. Peace studies is there have been a number of crucial turning points since 1960s that have had a significant effect on the development of the field of peace studies. These turning points is important for us to know that how it's embedded in international relations and how it's shaped the behavior of states and how states take them into account while they are evaluating their behavior. And let's go through with that. These that I'm going to count, these 3 events, are the most important and crucial ones in development of the peace studies or in the improvement of the peace studies. The first one is 1960s period, when the peace movement opposing the Vietnam War, and another one is the rise of nuclear freeze movement and the other disarmament campaigns at various stages of the Cold War. And another important one is the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. Here, the field of peace studies was originally conceived as a critical field of study that would constitute a viable alternative to more traditional field of study and the practice that we have seen up until now, and in general they knew as, or they name as, liberal and the realist way of evaluating the international system. And in other words, they known as mainstream theories. And peace studies is a transformative project, seeks to construct alternative accounts of social and the political realities, and therefore take place simultaneously in the domains of theory, research, and the practice and activities. In other way around, actually, they involve international relations with taking into account other disciplinary fields, such as sociology, as one of the most important disciplinary fields that need to be taken into account in order to evaluate social science, which its main base actually come from human existence. So at these times, one cannot ignore the relationship between the study and the practice of peace studies and related fields of inquiry, such as psychology, sociology, communication, security studies, international relations, and foreign policy. So, peace studies shift the focus of IR away from mainstream theories, which generally focus on interstate level of analysis, and rather towards a more broad conceptualizations of social relations at the individual, domestic, and the global level of analysis. So when you are studying related with the peace studies, you really can't ignore individual level, sub-state level, and any other global level analysis from your study in order to understand completely or whole picture regarding to the issue that you are concentrating on, which actually ignored under the mainstream theories, which they are generally based on interstate level, the relationship between states. And they are trying to understand the issue with the, for example, leaders' transactions, rather than going below this state level in order to understand the human constitutiveness in order to understand their psychological background or their tribal background, for example, related with the Middle Eastern studies, if you want to take Middle Eastern as a case. So here you can't really analyze Middle Eastern country by only looking to the region with state level perspective, because we sometimes see that the other levels or other actors rather than states is getting more effectual or more effective than the states to shape the region politics and the economic situations. So let's move to peace studies topics again. So it connects peace and the war with individual responsibility, economic inequality, gender relations, and cross-cultural understanding, and with other aspects of social relations, as I give an example from the Middle Eastern region. So it seeks the potentials for peace, not in the transactions of state leaders, but in the transformations of entire societies through social revolutions and in transnational communities. So you can't really achieve the concrete result over a conflict when you just focus on the interactions and the policy field of the state level. You need to go through with social constructions, with the social interactions, to understand what is their values and what is their values in order to let them to transform and let the conflict to be to transform in a more positive way. So you can't really ignore this social construction by only focusing on the state level analysis. So peace studies, actually, what it did as a contribution to international relations is that focus of inquiry by rejecting the supposed objectivity of traditional approaches, which in general they try to evaluate and look to issue through the natural scientific way of epistemological understanding. And here peace studies is just doing the opposites of that epistemology and trying to think that the good way to gain knowledge is to practice in action, not just to observe objectivity, as it's the case in a natural science. So you can't really understand international relations only by using the natural science methodology or natural science epistemology. So you need to really take the human constitutiveness and the human social structures within situations to understand what it's, how it's going to be transformed and what is the main circumstances under the issue. So that's the one of the important contributions of the peace studies that had for the international relations discipline. So, and under peace studies, conflict resolution can be given an example as an alternative to a violent way of handling the conflict. So here, the development and implementations of peace strategies for settling conflict is using alternative to violent forms of leverage. These methods competing with violent method and the work at in all international conflicts. Yes, up until now, we studied alternative to power politics, and now we move to another important concept related with international relation, which is international conflict. So here, in order to understand the nature of international conflict, including their potential for becoming violent, one must study the underlying interest and the goals of the actors involved. And here we actually see in general the most important let's say, types of the international conflicts under 6 titles. And we can divide these 6 titles under 2 different categories. And the one category known as the tangible material interest, and we can call this as a clash of interest. And these types can be counted as territorial border disputes. And in other ways, secessional attempts can be counted under this territorial dispute as well. So conflict over who controls the national government is the second category or types of international conflict. And the third one is economic conflict over trade, money, natural resources, drug trafficking, and the other economic transactions. And the rest 3, which can be counted under name of conflict of ideas as less tangible clashes of ideas, is as ethnic conflict is first one, religious conflict is the second, and the last one is ideological conflict. So let's go through with these conflicts in a more detailed way. The first one is the territorial border disputes, including secession attempts. So before that, it's important to know that conflict of interest lie at the heart of all international bargaining, from trade negotiations to arms control, but only sometimes they turn to violence. So we need to understand what is the interest in that in that conflict about states to understand its main causes. So territorial border disputes, including secession attempts, is an effort by a region to secede from a state, are a frequent sources of international conflict. But international norms generally treat such conflict as internal affairs or matters unless they spill over to other borders. Let's give an example. Yugoslavia broke up in 1991 and 2, and several publics declared their independence as separate states. And here, Croatia and Bosnia contained minority populations as ethnic Serbs, and the Serbs seized effective control of areas in Bosnia and Croatia that contained Serbian communities. So non-Serbian communities in these areas were massacred. So it's caused an ethnic cleaning by Serbians. So then Croatia reconquered most of its territory in 1995. This is the one of the basic example to understand how the territorial integrity or obtaining the territory from any other states or the territorial dispute is important in turning to international conflict. So breakup of state is not always, however, means that it's going to cause a violent or violation. So here another example in that terms is Czechoslovakia, which split into Czech Republic and Slovakia in a cooperative and the civil manner. So the second important type of international conflict is control of government, which may cause international conflict, is control of government. So here, one state invades another in order to change its government. Soviet Union did this in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And another example, which is in more near future in 2000, the US did this in Iraq, and its definite date is 2003, definite year. So the international conflict over the control of government along with territorial disputes are likely to lead the use of violence. They involve core issues of territorial integrity of states and the status. So therefore, it's more likely to handled by violent means of leverage, such as war or terrorism or this kind of leverage. So other type of conflict are both more desperate and less likely to lead to violence. So let's move on these other three, which named under conflict of ideas and less tangible way of conflict. So before that, we just forget to mention economic conflict. So economic conflict is one among these. So it seldom leads to violence today because military forms of leverage are no longer very effective in economic conflict. So with the tight integrations of the world economy and high cost of military action, the use of force is rarely justified to solve an economic conflict. And here the globalization actually is one of the important development or the process or progress that tied nearly the whole states and nation state together in a political, economic and cultural way. So that's for state to handle the problem in a different way of leverage rather than the military use of force. So most economic conflicts are not issues in international security, as they are generally discussed under international political economy. However, economic conflict as do still bear on international security in some ways. It affects on military industry capacity to produce military equipment, especially high technology weapons such as fighter aircraft. There is a world trade in such items, but national government try to keep control of such production to ensure that national interests take priority over those of manufacturer and that states is military self-sufficient in case of war. And here we saw that national interests come in front of the economic interest, and there is a interrelations between them, and the national government try to define their national security, their survival as a priority in front of the manufacturer interest. In other words, economic competition, which means who profits, interwoven with security concern over who gets access to weapons. So the transfer of knowledge to, for example, hostile state is related to this concern. So economic competition as a source of international conflict has important implications for international security. Nonetheless, military force plays a diminishing role in resolving economic conflict. In fact, increasing economic reliance between states likely lowers the chance of fighting over economic and the political differences. As before a while I give the examples of the process of globalization, which leads or force states or each state to integrate these economic liberalizations. So this economic development. So none of any states in international arena actually keep themselves 100% away from this economic improvement, economic development or economic integration. Therefore, that prevents states to take more protective actions or more or use of force in order to protect their interests, because they have to take into account their economic ties with other states, which prevent them to take another form of leverage to stop or to turn this international conflict in their advantage. So conflict of ideas, which I mentioned before a while as a less tangible types of conflict in international relations and the security, is ethnic conflict, is one of them. Most important sources of conflict can be counted as ethnic conflicts. So ethnic groups here are those large groups of people who share language, culture, or religious tie and a common identity. Although conflict between ethnic groups often have material aspects like control of government and territory, ethnic conflict itself stems from a dislike of one ethnic group towards others. So ethnic groups often form the basis for nationalist sentiments. However, not all ethnic groups identify as nation, like in America, because within the United States, various ethnic groups coexist with a common national identity, which known as Americans. So territorial control closely tied to the aspirations of ethnic groups' statehood. So with this kind of aspirations of ethnic groups to statehood, it's more likely to turn to internal and international conflict. So we can give Kurds, for example, as an important example as ethnic group which lacks home state who share a culture. So here the cause of ethnic conflict or ethnic hostility is important in order to observe how ethnic identity, how ethnic conflict exists as one important causes of international conflict under international security. So here we can count it, this hostility of ethnic issue or cause as long-lasting historical conflict over specific territories or natural resources, or over one ethnic group's economic exploitations to others, or political dominations of one group over another. So these kind of configurations or these kind of actions or decisions lead ethnic groups which feel themselves as, let's say, minority, dominated, ignored and excluded within the existing system, may feel themselves as discriminated, and they wish to, if it has historical backgrounds and the disputes as well within that existing state, to express themselves in a more violent way, to acquire or to gain their advantage or to gain their let's say statehood or separate statehood within existing system. So that's in that term, ethnic conflict can turn to be international conflict. But this can be actually handled through peaceful ways of handling conflict as well. So this doesn't mean that it's going to be turned violent conflict. So it can be handled by a more cooperative and more peaceful way or dialogue way of diplomatic sources of handling the conflict. But it can be accounted as one of the important, let's say, type of international conflict. So let's move to religious one. Religious is another less tangible type of conflict under international conflict and with international security field. But here in religious conflict, as the ideas of the conflict, it needs to be known that nothing inherent in religion mandates conflict. So you can't really associate religion with conflict. in several centuries or in several countries, Islamic fundamentalists rejects Western-oriented secular states in favor of governments more explicitly oriented to Islamic values. These movements reflects long-standing anti-Western sentiments in these countries against old European colonizers who were Christians. In some Middle Eastern countries, for example, with authoritarian government, religion institutions such as mosques have been the only available avenue for political opposition. So religion has therefore become a means for expression opposition to the status quo in both political and culture. So that's why religion is it exists a kind of institutions to express their opposition against maybe to system. So another important types of conflict in international relations is the ideological one. So ideological can help to mobile people to support a state in its international dealing, such as war. So here, Nazi Germany can be given as an example because Nazi's ideology, fascism, inflamed German nationalism before World War II, legitimizing German aggression by placing it an ideological framework. So if you have ideology behind your policy, it's more easily to mobilize people to follow you. So then it has a mobility power in order to turn the, let's say, issue to international conflict. So ideology, in other way around, can sharpen the conflict between two rivals as happened to the superpowers during Cold War. Ideology like religion symbolizes an intensified conflict between groups and the states more than it caused them. So rather than we can't really say 100% that the ideology can be a main cause of international conflict, but morally it's a symbolizer or intensified conflict, or it's a mobilizer way of affecting the international conflict. So, as a result, all 6 types of conflict just discussed can be perceived through peaceful or violent means. We can therefore better understand conflict by examining the types of leverage that come into play in international conflict. War and other violent action taken in international conflicts are aimed at settling conflicts by a violent way or negative form of leverage. States can also, however, have alternative forms or means of leverage and strategies to handle this conflict, these problems. For example, conflict resolutions, diplomatic attempts, diplomacy, peace studies, all of these alternative forms of leverage is important means of leverage to handle the conflict more peacefully. Yes, this is end of our this week's session. Next week we are going to move to continue with another issues in international relations. Thank you for listening.